Hi, it's Doug Isenberg, and I'm excited to be talking today with Renee Fossen, who is the Director of Arbitration at the Forum, formerly known as the National Arbitration Forum, which is one of the leading providers of domain name dispute services, including under the UDRP, or Uniform Domain Name Dispute Resolution Policy. Renee is an attorney with a background in litigation and has served as the Forum's Director of Arbitration since September 2016, where she manages all aspects of arbitration and mediation, including those under the UDRP, the URS, or Uniform Rapid Suspension System, and a number of other domain name dispute policies as well. So the Forum was founded in 1986 and is headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And in addition to providing domain name dispute services, the Forum also specializes in arbitration and mediation administration services in the areas of business to business, employment, franchise, intellectual property, and managed programs. So Renee, it's nice to see you.
Thanks, Doug. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So as I mentioned in the introduction, the Forum was actually founded in 1986, which was many years before the UDRP even existed, and long before the first UDRP complaint was filed in 1999. Now, I suspect that most people watching this video associate the Forum solely with the UDRP and other domain name dispute services, which I know accounts for most of the Forum's work, but not all of it. So perhaps we can begin with a little background from you about the Forum itself. Can you tell those watching what the Forum is and what the Forum does?
Sure. Thanks for mentioning that. Yes, a lot of people do just know us because of domain dispute, but we do provide other arbitration mediation services as well outside of the domain name world. We do traditional mediation and arbitration, as you mentioned, in those particular fields. But really, our specialty is setting up managed programs or programs for different industries and companies seeking a streamlined dispute resolution process. So we've done some work with the moving and storage associations. We have a program there for interstate transport of household goods. We've done some work in the insurance industry. And most recently, we have developed a program called Mediator Connect, which is essentially, we're kind of billing it as the Uber for mediation, where you go online, you fill out a form, kind of describing your dispute, what you're looking for in a mediator, and then we search our roster and connect you with qualified mediators to mediate your case. We've also done some work with Public Interest Registry back in the domain name world, an appeal program for DNS abuse for them as well. So that's the most two recent programs we've set up in the last calendar year.
Okay, thanks, Renee. So that's interesting, but it's true, isn't it, that the bulk of the Forum's work is still focused on domain name disputes. Is that right?
I would say that's probably true, yes.
Okay. And 2020 was for the Forum, I guess, for domain name disputes in general, as we've seen elsewhere globally, a record year. The data that I've seen shows that filings at the Forum were up about 16% in 2020. And 2020 was a record year since the first UDRP complaint was filed over 20 years ago, and the busiest year since 2011. So I guess first just double check me and make sure I've got the data right, and if so, what can you tell us about why 2020 was such a busy year and how the Forum's been, and you in particular, I suppose, have been handling such an increase in cybersquatting?
It actually came as quite a surprise, I believe, that 2020 was as busy as it was, given that the pandemic started essentially in the United States in March of 2020, and we immediately went remote as far as most of our staff. We had a skeleton staff in the office handling mail and accounting functions, but we had to seamlessly move remote with our staff. So challenges right away out of the gate, but we handled them pretty well. I would have thought that we would have seen a decrease in cases given the companies that were involved in protecting their trademarks maybe weren't quite sure how the pandemic would affect their business, and maybe they would not have the funds that they normally would allocate to these types of protection. That didn't turn out to be the case, and you're correct that we had the busiest filing year we'd ever had since the implementation of the UDRP. I think that's because some of those industries maybe weren't impacted as much as we thought they would be. We did see a decrease in entertainment industries, fashion, travel, of course, that makes sense. But we saw generally the same or an increased amount of filings in the financial services, pharmaceuticals, and insurance areas. So they kind of balanced out and actually kind of pushed us over the top, I believe. I think another factor is that the registrations of domain names likely increased during that time period as well. And there were times where maybe those cyber squatters had more time to actually do their thing, and there were also probably more time for attorneys to actually track that stuff down and be able to remedy it through the UDRP.
Right. As I tell my clients, nothing ever surprises me. And what I mean by that in part is, what type of activities cyber squatters actually engage in. And there's, never been, a world event or a corporate announcement that did not create, an opportunity for cyber squatters to take advantage of. So you're right. I think while we've all been trapped at home for the past year, we're talking now in February 2021, so it is going on almost a year now, that cyber squatters are looking for new opportunities, just like everybody else, for better and for worse, I suppose. But it's interesting because there's been maybe a small category of domain name disputes that I've seen that have specifically targeted what we have been going through. And I'm talking about domain names, that contain the words, COVID or coronavirus or vaccine, or even I know at the forum, Purell as a trademark. Have you seen many of those, or are those just sort of anecdotes that I hear about?
I can't say that we've seen a lot of them. I would say probably less than 5% of our filings actually involve the coronavirus itself, either in the name or a product that may be related to an issue with the coronavirus. So I can't say that it was a driver for the number of cases that we've seen this year, but certainly it was an issue, and it did trickle throughout our other lines of business as well. We've seen family law cases where there's visitation issues with a parent that may have COVID or maybe not taking it as seriously as the other parent, and we've seen it in some business disputes with vaccines and things like that as well. So yeah, it's there, but I don't think as it in of itself has been the driver in the number of cases that we've seen this year.
Right, and I know back as far as the middle of March 2020, you sent out sort of a notice that the forum had switched to a remote work operation. That in a sense is one of the beauties of the UDRP process. Is it is all conducted online. As I tell my clients all the time, the dispute providers are located around the world. You're in Minneapolis, but and trademark owners and cyber squatters are also located all around the world. But one of the reasons the UDRP was created in the first place was to address the global nature of the internet. And so that's why all the filings take place online, and there's no need to show up in person. So in some ways, domain name disputes were already well positioned to deal with something like the pandemic.
That's true. And when it comes to our other lines of business, with the moving and storage and some of those other programs, they're also that way, where they're on the papers, and there doesn't need to be a live hearing unless that's an option chosen by the parties. But we have had our traditional mediation and arbitration. We did have to adjust some of our protocols there and switch to a Zoom platform for those. We trained our staff on how to use Zoom and assign people to breakout rooms so that we can help the mediators and arbitrators navigate that process, so that when they do have to have a live hearing, we're ready to go and help them do that.
Right. What about impacts on domain name disputes in particular, though, as far as the logistics of filing, even though it's all online in the first place? Have there been any particular logistical challenges either from you and the forum staff or from parties? Certainly been aware of cases in which parties have asked for extensions related to difficulties in filing because of the coronavirus. I think it's sometimes a little hard to know whether those requests are genuine or not. Have you seen much of that, and how do you handle that?
We actually did not see a lot of that. We did have a few cases where the requests were requested, extension requests were requested, and we did grant those to the extent possible. When it was a long-term request, we did assign that to a panelist that happened to be in the area where the respondent resided, just to make sure that we understood specifically geographically what was going on in that particular area and if those arguments made sense, and left it to the panelists to decide how much time to allow for that. So that's how we handled those. When it comes to logistically for our day-to-day work, the only thing that we had to think about was mail and where that was going to be done. And we do have somebody in the office that's processing our mail and of course the accounting functions as well. Getting people paid and getting the bills paid, those things need to happen in the office. But other than that, we have not had any difficulties at all.
Right, and the UDRP rules themselves were changed a number of years ago before the pandemic to eliminate the need for the hard copy filing, which I think, if I recall correctly, the forum had sort of handled on a fax basis. But regardless, all filings are electronic these days. I mean, does the forum receive any hard copy filings? I'm not even sure they're allowed under the rules anymore.
We do not. We receive payment that way, of course. Not everybody uses a credit card. We still get checks for some filings. So, and we do have to, when we're serving the respondent, we have to fax, email, and mail. So those are the three main things that we do from the office is just make sure that, of course, the email can happen remotely with the case coordinators, but we have to have somebody in the office that faxes and hard copy mails those things out, despite 90% of that mail being returned.
Right, but because of fraudulent addresses and contact information provided by cybersquatters when registering domain names, is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So, and it's interesting because you mentioned the case coordinators. I think, that actually puts a bit of a face on the process. There are real people like you and your staff behind the scenes who are managing this tremendous caseload of domain name disputes. And I know, based on my experience as a panelist, but also as a party's representative, that you and your staff are available, not really on a substantive, not for substantive questions about how do I make out my case or how do I defend my case, but what is actually required and what can I do? And I know you've got a policy for being pretty responsive to those types of inquiries. And I think sometimes people forget that you are real human beings behind the scenes making this process work.
Yes, that's true. We have a great staff. We've got one member of our case coordinator staff that has been involved since 1999 when the UDRP first came into being. So she's probably one of the few people in the world that's been there from the beginning until the present, actually. So she's got a great handle on it and has seen all kinds of things and can answer all kinds of procedural questions, as you mentioned. And we've got other case coordinators, of course, that are available to answer those. So they can, an email can be sent to our domain dispute email box, or our number can be called that's listed on our website. And we can help people with their questions in advance if they have any questions, and respondents as well. Of course, reach out if you have a question on how to respond. And we've got forms on our website, complaint forms, response forms. When it comes to the UDRP, when it comes to the URS, we've got a PowerPoint slide show that you can run through to show you exactly how to file either a complaint or a response. Lots of resources available there as well.
Yeah, and one other that I'd also recommend, to my clients, one that I keep tabs on, is you do have a daily email update of decisions under the UDRP and the other policies that the forum handles. And so it's obviously impossible to read all of those, thousands of decisions per year, or at least it's impossible for me. I think it's interesting to look at those on a daily basis and see, which trademark owners are active and what are the trends as far as how the decisions are turning out, which are still overwhelmingly in favor of trademark owners, but it's always interesting to spot check some of those decisions, which I like to do.
Yes, that's true. We have the daily decision email, and then we also have a pretty robust search engine on our website as well. If you're looking for something specific, you can put a keyword in or a date range for decisions and get the information that way as well.
And you can also search by type of domain dispute policy. I know we've been talking about the UDRP mostly because that's the big domain name dispute policy, but it's not the only one. And as I said at the outset, it's not the only policy that the forum administers. You also administer the US DRP, which is a very similar, with one significant difference, policy to the UDRP for the .us country code top-level domain. You also administer the URS, as I said, as well as the USRS, and a number of other policies. But it's the UDRP that really has been seeing, and the USDRP, I suppose, to the extent that many cases are filed there, that has seen the increase. We've seen something pretty different in recent years with URS filings. And if my numbers are right for URS filings at the forum, not only did those decline in 2020, but they were actually the lowest level since the URS went into effect, and the first complaint under the URS was filed in 2013. About a 22% increase from 2019 to 2020. I talk with my clients about the URS as an alternative to the UDRP for some top-level domains. Obviously, it still does not apply to .com and .net, so it's not an option there. It has a more limited remedy than the UDRP, that is temporary suspension of a domain name instead of the possibility of a transfer, and a high burden of proof. But there just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of traction. If anything, it's losing traction. The URS is my perception of that correct?
I think your perception is correct. I think it's not an attractive option for many of the trademark holders that are out there doing these things because of the remedy. It's not a transfer, it's a suspension. As you mentioned, the burden of proof is higher. Sure, the fees are less expensive, but then you still have to track that domain and keep an eye on it. Once that suspension period ends, it's anybody's guess as to where it'll end up next. So I think that you're right on with your analysis. It's unfortunate because I think it could be used in ways that maybe aren't being used yet, but we'll see what happens. Yeah.
Well, and it applies to .org now as well, as I've tried to make known. But there are, we sort of used to speak traditionally of the big three GTLDs, .com, .net, and .org. And while the URS does not apply to .com and .net, it does apply to .org now, but still there are very few even URS complaints filed for .org domain names. I wonder if part of the reason, in addition to everything that you were talking about, is a lack of awareness by trademark owners about the URS. Do you have a sense about how well known it is?
I really don't, actually, because we've talked about it in ICANN and the working groups that we've got there, and it seems like those bigger trademark holders know about it, but I still don't think that it's an attractive option for them, just because it may cost almost more money to track something like that in the suspension period rather than just go for the transfer with a lower burden of proof. So that you're paying more up front, but you don't have that long-term, exposure with that domain name.
Right. So the UDRP, as far as I can tell, still remains the domain dispute policy of choice for most trademark owners, even if the URS is an option. So let me just ask on the UDRP, because I've been in this world a long time, and I know as a result I sometimes lose perspective. But there are a number. The forum is one of a number of UDRP providers, essentially accredited by ICANN around the world. and you are the only one based in the United States. Does that matter? And how do you talk with folks about how the forum might be different from any of the other providers, and how should a decision be made by a trademark owner, which is ultimately the party who chooses the lowercase forum, where to file? How should trademark owners go about deciding whether to file with you or with one of the other providers? What are some of the factors to consider?
Well, I think whether the fact that we're in the United States, I'm not sure that it makes a whole lot of difference. I think there are U.S. filers that file with the others, and we have filers that are outside the U.S. that file with Forum, although that we're U.S. based. I think our differentiator is that we have great customer service or filer service for the respondent and the complainant. Anybody can call us, email us, and ask us a question, and we're going to get back to them hopefully within 24 hours of when we get the request. Also, our decision times are pretty quick. So from commencement to a decision date is usually around 35 days average, typically no more than 40 days. So we're pretty quick that way too, just because of our internal efficiencies with our technology that we're using for our portal and our tracking of the cases.
And you're able to handle foreign language filings, not just English filings. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Because I hear that from clients sometimes who think that, well, because you're in the United States and, a lot of people are like me and don't speak other languages other than English in the United States. But it is possible to file complaints. If a client is considering filing a complaint in another language, and the language is typically, though not always, dictated by the language of the registration agreement, what's the process for finding out whether the forum can handle a complaint in a particular language?
It might be best to contact the domain dispute email box if you have any questions about that, and we'll take a look at it and let you know if there should be any difficulty with it within the 24-hour period of time. But we do have panelists all over the world, just like the other providers that speak multiple languages, so we're certainly at the ready for that.
And speaking of all over the world, one issue that has become a bit challenging recently is the European Union's GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which in practical purposes has meant that a lot of contact information in the WHOIS records for domain name registrations is no longer available, which creates challenges for trademark owners when filing their complaints for a number of different reasons. I know the forum actually amended its rules in the recent past. Was that in response to the GDPR, and what impacts have you seen from that?
We did amend our rules, the supplemental rules, based on the GDPR. That was kind of the impetus to make those changes, mainly because we didn't want to have our filers rely on the WHOIS definition in the rules anymore. So we changed that out and replaced it with publicly available registration data, so that it's clear that you can file with that information. We'll contact the registrar. We'll get the correct information. We'll let you know what that is. We'll ask you to amend your complaint, and then we'll move forward with it with the correct information from the registrar.
So the absence, again, this is a misconception that I hear sometimes from clients who are just not familiar with the UDRP and domain name dispute policies, that the absence of that contact information or correct identifying information for a domain name registrant is not an obstacle, or at least does not prevent the filing of a UDRP complaint. That's
correct. ICANN had issued the temporary specification immediately upon the GDPR taking effect, and changed the process so that it's allowed under both the URS and the UDRP to be able to file with the information that you've got available.
One other change, if I if I recall correctly, to the forum's supplemental rules that was made at the same time, addressed the issue of supplemental filings, which sort of by way of background for those who are not familiar, the UDRP is essentially designed as a streamlined process with a complaint and a response. And through the years, parties have tried to file, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, what are referred to as supplemental filings. So perhaps a response to the response. And then the registrant of the domain name may want to, then also submit additional information or documents itself. And that's not directly allowed by the rules. And in the past, I think the forum has taken the approach that there would be a fee to submit those supplemental filings. And the revision to the supplemental rules has eliminated that fee. Did I get all that correct?
That's correct. Forum was charging a fee because they were getting many of these additional submission requests and thought it would be a way to curb those filings if there was a fee attached to it. It didn't necessarily do that. So keeping in line with what the other providers were doing, I amended those rules to take the fee out of it, and it will be left to the panelists to decide whether to consider those additional submissions should we receive any. I think the concern was when the rule was implemented that having some sort of structure in place would at least provide some groundwork for it and seem like it would be fair to both parties if there were some an actual rule based around how we would receive those and what would happen with them. And taking that away, we were a little concerned that it would turn into the Wild West and we would get all kinds of additional filings, multiples on each case, where we would typically get one, and that hasn't been the case. So that's been a relief that it hasn't been an issue where we're inundated by additional submissions without fees. So I think it's worked out for the best, and when the UDRP is reviewed sometime in the future here, we'll see what any working group or ICANN has to say about additional submissions at that point, but we'll just kind of do what the other providers are doing at this point and see how it goes.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to remember sometimes the UDRP has not always been around. I began doing this work a few years before the UDRP even existed, but that's ancient history now, and how the UDRP may evolve in the future obviously is a bit of an open question. But based on the filing trends, it obviously is remaining very attractive. Are there any other misconceptions that maybe we've not touched on? I know we talked a little bit about filing language and unavailability of some whois data, but are there other misconceptions? I know you talk about obviously these issues all the time, domain name disputes, as to what can or cannot be done, or even how the UDRP is appropriately used.
Nothing comes to mind as far as misconceptions. I think that there is certainly a segment of the population out there that maybe isn't even aware that it exists, and just how to get to those people, I'm not quite sure. But I think the UDRP is working well. I think it's widely accepted by those that are using it, and even respondents I think have adopted it as a decent way to resolve a dispute. So as far as misconceptions, I hope that there aren't a lot of them out there yet, but I guess I can't think of any off the top of my head.
No, well, I mean, I think you're right, sort of about the visibility of the UDRP itself, even though it's been more than 20 years. I mean, that's why we're talking today in part, to hopefully make those who are unfamiliar with the UDRP familiar with it, or provide a bit more education for those who may not have been through the process before. I created a masterclass series of videos on the UDRP and other domain name disputes recently. So I think, again, I know I sometimes lose perspective. What's that expression about, when you carry a hammer, all you see are nails. And so, I think everybody knows about domain name disputes, and how the process works, but obviously that's not the case. So I just want to thank you for coming here today remotely, so to speak, and talking about the services that you provide at the forum.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks a lot.